Hello, my name is Pharaoh Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, and today we're going to be talking about the roots of white supremacy culture. The very earliest foundations of white supremacy culture, at least in a modern sense, is best traced back to the latter half of the 15th century. In this time, there were two papal edicts, Dum Diversas and Inter Caetera, which were proclaimed by the Pope to grant European Catholic monarchs a right to enslave and conquer, and a theological justification to enslave and conquer non-Christians. Now, at the time when this was originally declared, the main purpose of this was for continued conflict with the North African kingdoms that Spain and Portugal had been at war with for centuries. But later, when the New World was discovered, these things were leveraged fully against them to have theological justification for the enslavement of the entirety of the population of these new continents. This is very important even for things that would come after and only be tangentially related, because this is one of the earliest points where you have important legal and theological framing for European Christians deeming themselves superior or having the right to, divvy up the world to be spread apart and claimed by their powers and not consult or have to worry about the sovereignty or power of other states. This is a very important part of this history because this directly led to the triangle trade. Once these new European settlements were set up in the New World, they existed, sure, but in order to make them profitable, in order to make them economically viable for the kingdom setting them up, they needed a massive manpower pool, which could not be fulfilled by the native populations of these colonies that were going to set these things up. Spain and Portugal just did not have the population necessary to have the manpower to make these places profitable. At first, this was solved by enslaving the Native Americans, but this could only be done for so long for a variety of reasons, primarily because the population declined so quickly due to disease. So eventually, in order to fill this manpower necessity for the colonies, this was the primary reason why African slaves were imported from Africa, brought to the New World in order to turn these large swaths of land into profitable centers for growing various cash crops. It is a very, very lengthy process where African slaves would be purchased by Europeans, brought over in massive numbers to the colonies where the mortality rate of these slaves laboring was incredibly high, and therefore need to replace them was incredibly high, which created an entire interconnected system of slaves from Africa, creating products in the New World, which were then sent to Europe and then distributed. It's very important to have the perception of how the economic viability of this system over time is what caused the racial dynamic to be so societally entrenched, where you have the African slave and laborer working underneath the European master. And over time, this would become seen as a natural phenomenon by the Europeans. A very important turning point in the history within the United States of these racial dynamics was with Bacon's Rebellion. So in addition to African slaves, which were the vast majority used to plug the manpower pool, there was also no shortage of poor and disenfranchised European immigrant groups, which, in order to build any kind of living for themselves, usually because they had practically nothing in their home countries, they would sell years of service of their life and live in similar to slave-like conditions. And because of this, in the early Americas, in the 13 colonies, African slaves and white indentured servants labored under the very similar systems of oppression that was used to hold over them. As a result of this, they joined together and revolted simultaneously and with a joint effort to do so. This was very important because it greatly scared the ruling class of the 13 colonies at the time, particularly in the southern states where slave labor was more common. And because of this, there was a much more active emphasis put on the racial difference, even with very poor and powerless white people, to give them a sense of difference and distinction from the African slaves that they had once fought alongside. This is a very important dynamic for how we reach a modern approximation for the sense of superiority of poor white people over black people. Another very important step of the history of white supremacy in the United States is the concept of manifest destiny, where the heavily settled eastern coast of the United States, originally the 13 colonies, later the United States, with a much stronger industrial base, with a much higher population, would, seeing the vast and empty expanses of land to the west, would form great caravans and spread westward as far as they can in order to bridge the entirety of the gap between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean that would later become the borders of the modern United States. This was horrifically detrimental to the Native American populations that called this part of the continental North America their home, a vast population of which were Native Americans that had once lived on the eastern coast of the United States, were already forced to vacate from that part of the country further westward. And then, as the European descended Americans continued to move westward, they had less and less and less land until eventually they had practically none at all. It was largely considered, to draw a parallel to the earlier positions that we had talked about, a divine aspect, that it was a God granted right for the American people to do this, which is very similar to the papal edicts, which granted a similar sense of divine or theological justification for these horrific acts that were committed. A very important aspect of the history of the racial dynamic in the United States comes with a very specific aspect of how it was legislated. So a very strong example of this is with the Dred Scott decision, where it was legally determined that Black African Americans were ineligible for citizenship regardless of the situation that they found themselves in, even in situations where they might not find themselves in the, deep antebellum slavery culture that existed throughout much of the country. This was a broader legal mandate that was put out throughout the country. And even after the end of the Civil War, when slavery was no longer legal, this entrenchment in law just found a way to adapt and change to the changing country. So now that it was no longer legal to enslave African Americans outright, there were massive amounts of laws that were drafted in order to continue to regulate, control, and oppress Black people, even without the institution of slavery formally existing. This can be done in a variety of ways, to criminalizing incredibly minor or benign activities when performed by Black people, and entire systems that provided a very strong economic entrapment that forced a lot of African Americans to continue to live and work in basically slave conditions long after the end of slavery being legally formally allowed. Another very strong example of the history of white supremacy culture in the United States is with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is actually the only law ever passed in the United States that specifically forbade one ethnic group or nationality from ever immigrating into the United States. This was done at a time when there was a very large influx of Chinese immigrants moving into the United States for various labor positions. And they were immigrating at such a high rate that the white population of the United States felt threatened by this new menace, as they would think of them, coming in from China, and would specifically pass a law forbidding them from coming. This would later be extrapolated into broader anti-immigration laws for Asian immigrants and even some Southern European and Eastern European immigrants. But this was the foundation for those things that would come after. A very important aspect of the continuation of the trends of these old systems and power dynamics of racial disparity being changed and modernized through control of the law is with redlining and the manipulation of the GI Bill. So redlining was an aspect of separation and essentially informal, but basically still de facto segregation between black and white neighborhoods, where black people were unable to purchase land or find residence in tons of different areas, which were kept separate and purely for the ownership and occupation of white citizens. In addition to this, there were many economic incentives that were granted to American soldiers that fought in the Second World War that allowed them to, once they returned from the conflict, buy homes and properties that would literally create the entire backbone of the now in the modern day American working class, because it allowed for people without expensive educations or moneyed backgrounds to acquire these incredibly valuable pieces of land. And so, because of this, lots of white families were able to create a middle class lifestyle for themselves. And though legally black soldiers should have been offered the same opportunity, they were just excluded. And this creates a massive wealth disparity between black families that can trace their family roots to being in the States at this time, and white families that can do the same. As we have the continuation of these systems and how they've begun, how they grow, how they adapt over time, we can still see prominent examples of fighting back against this injustice. We have the civil rights movement of the United States, which was a massive movement for technically broad racial and other forms of equality as well, that were fought for in the United States, but were primarily led by and organized by African American advocates that were advocating for equal rights, an end to segregation, and a way to balance the massive centuries long division and disadvantage that African Americans had lived with since the origins of Western civilization in the Americas, but certainly since the end of slavery when they were officially given citizenship. We have here presented a number of different cultural values that have been greatly ingrained into Western culture, and especially North American Western culture, over the course of centuries. And as a result of this, many of these beliefs, many of these values are things that have been unconsciously programmed basically into all citizens throughout the United States, Canada, parts of Mexico. It is an aspect that has become integral to a lot of our lifestyles. But it's important to understand and to appreciate the true origins of where these beliefs come from. Are these things that you have observed in your family, in your workplace, in your schools? I'm Pharaoh Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, and thank you for listening.